We're going to get going in about a little less than a minute. So grab your coffee. Are we online, Keith? We are up. I bet you're all intrigued right about now.
There we go.
So, okay, we're just going to go ahead and get going. That was a quick minute, but I want to have as much time as possible with our guest. And I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and then spent much of my life in Missouri. So earthquakes weren't a big part of it, although I did get acquainted with the New Madrid fault a couple times when I was woken up by a little bit of shaking at our house in St. Louis. I knew that I wasn't in, I guess not Kansas, but Missouri anymore when I first got to All Saints Church, and my first week here, they're introducing me to everything, and Melissa Hayes has me up sort of looking at the altar book, and she flips to the back of the book on the altar, and there are instructions of what to say during an earthquake. And I thought, okay, I'm not in St. Louis anymore. I will say, if we have an earthquake during this forum, she will be giving the instructions, not me. And so, as I said when you and I talked earlier, it's like I didn't grow up, knowing who you were, and I love people who are locally famous for really cool, sort of niche reasons.
It's about as sweet.
And it's awesome. So I'm going to read you the bio. As one of the world's most recognizable seismologists, Dr. Lucy Jones has a unique talent for making even the most complicated of scientific concepts accessible to all audiences. In her 33 years as a seismologist for the U.S. Geological Survey, she was often deployed after earthquakes to comfort, counsel, and inform a rattled public. Through her decades of research and public advocacy for risk reduction, she has dramatically changed the way Californians prepare for and react to disaster. Much of Dr. Jones' work stems from this question: what good is scientific knowledge if people don't use it? In 2016, Dr. Jones retired from her position at the U.S. Geological Survey in order to work with government officials to create science-based policies for disaster preparedness. She founded the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, whose mission is to foster the understanding and application of scientific information to create more resilient communities. As a speaker, she explains the best ways to communicate scientific ideas to media and policymakers, but also addresses women in science and earthquake preparedness with her trademark storytelling skills. Her book, The Big Ones, is a riveting history of natural disasters and their impact on our culture, which also offers new ways of thinking about the ones to come. And she has turned her attention now in the what good is scientific knowledge if people don't use it arena to climate change. And so can we welcome and give thanks for our lower blood pressure as the Los Angeles area to Dr. Lucy Jones.
I guess I need to pick this up, don't I? Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I actually have never seen that bio.
It's from your website.
Okay, I should have been checking what my staff is doing, I guess.
You want to maybe hold this a little?
Okay,
there
yes,
you go.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for having me. We're here for Earth Day. We're here for climate change. I am a lifelong Episcopalian, grew up on the west side, and am now at St. James, South Pasadena. And I thought I'd start by giving just a little bit of a story of this process, because I am now a member of the Bishop's Commission on Climate Change. And from a fundamental position that what's coming from the climate crisis will be so much worse than the earthquakes, I cannot justify promoting seismic safety policy when we won't deal with climate change. So how do we deal with climate change? And I think I can use some of what I've learned about risk perception and communication and storytelling to help us move forward on climate change. recognizing that it's not a lack of well, there have been denials that it's even true. Nobody actually would actually logically believe that, but emotionally, we are feel much safer if we believe climate change isn't happening. So my fundamental principle, if you tune out for the rest of the talk, I have discovered that people would rather feel safe than be safe, because we don't have an internal fact checker to tell us what's actually true. And there are a lot of ways to feel safe. If I believe that COVID won't kill me, I feel a lot safer. When somebody else wears a mask, they are denying my worldview that's allowing me to feel safe, so I get angry. There's a lot of ways that this plays out when you look at danger. So that's the bottom line. We'll get around to it through all of this. But it seems like, I don't know how much you want to just ask me questions, or should I start a little story?
Let's start a story. If I said that I want to talk, there would have been a revolt in this room. So go ahead.
Okay.
Start with the story.
Let's start with the story of Earth Day. I'll be rude and say that I look around this room and think that there's a pretty high percentage of us who were around when earthquake started, which was 1970, right after the landing on the moon. And it was a time both of anger about pollution. It's a time when Love Canal had just happened. For those of us who grew up in LA, I remember on the west side having smog days where the stage 3 alert required us to not go to school, right? We got to remember what pollution was before all of this. But it was also a time of optimism. We landed on the moon. We could do anything. And it was partly that optimism that said we can deal with the environmental issues and clean them up. It's also, for me personally, my father was an aerospace engineer, helped design the lunar module descent engine, the actual piece of equipment that got them down to the moon without crashing. If his work had screwed up, they would have crashed. It was sort of an interesting time, way to watch the moon landing. Did you do your job, Dad? Right? But it also inspired me. It's how I ended up being in science. Went to graduate school in 1976 at MIT to study seismology. By then, I'd been doing physics and discovered I love wave theory, because I'm also play these instruments and do a lot of waves in other ways. I thought I was going to, save the world with earthquake prediction, or at least the part of us silly enough to live near the San Andreas Fault. Over the next 20 years, I did a lot of work trying to find anything that would work, and came to the conclusion, I think the majority of my colleagues at this point, that earthquakes are fundamentally unpredictable. You don't want me to predict every earthquake. You want me to predict which of the 50 that will happen today, the 20,000 that will happen in Southern California this year, which one will be large enough to do something to you. So we're actually asking for prediction of the magnitude. And as far as we can tell, little earthquakes and big earthquakes start the same way. They just end differently. The big ones don't stop. And if that's true, they're fundamentally unpredictable. It will never happen. And I started switching my research from that, which I had thought was going to be the useful part, to what we actually understand. Talking about prediction is focusing on the part we don't understand, which is what scientists do. Once we understand it, it's boring. But for the public, we never talk then about the part we do understand, which is what the earthquake's going to do. How do you build a building? Where are you cutting corners? So I started getting into impacts of disasters, and long story, but I ended up leading a project about a lot of different disasters and discovering all the similarities. And that's really why I ended up writing that book. All the different, you can look at hurricanes, or look at floods, or look at earthquakes, or look at volcanoes. What they do to society has some really strong overlap. And eventually, as I said, came to realize that what's happening from climate is so much worse. I need to deal with it. And as a government scientist, I couldn't. For completely valid reasons. When I'm talking as a government scientist, the government's seal of approval is on me. And so I talk only about what I'm actually, my personal, expertise. Climate, I'm not an atmospheric scientist, right? And of course, I looked at it and say, this isn't actually about atmospheric science. This is about risk perception. This is all the social side. But it was helped contribute to a decision which many other government scientists joined me in 2016 to leave the government. So that's where I got to this. So here I am trying to figure out what risk perception means for climate change. And there's, boy, I'm not quite where I thought I was going to be at this point in the talk, or this discussion. I'm also sitting here holding this instrument. Right? This is another big part of my life. I began life as a cellist. In college, I switched to this, which is called a viola da gamba. I don't know how many people have ever heard of it. It's the Renaissance, you could say it's a Renaissance predecessor. It's actually a different family. Have you ever noticed that in the orchestra there's a double bass? What's the single bass? It's the bass viola da gamba. This is actually a tenor. So just like the violin family that comes in multiple sizes, violin, viola, cello, the viol family, comes in the violone, which evolved into the double bass. The bass, this is a tenor, there's a treble, there's a partisu, which is even smaller. To point out some differences, notice the flat back. All the violin families have curved backs. The sloping shoulders, these are all like the double bass, not like a cello. And of course, 6 strings with frets, that's no longer on the double bass. They're tuned in fourths, where the violin family's tuned in fifths. So this was tuned much like a guitar. In fact, the same instrument went to Spain and became the guitar, went to Italy where they added a bow and became the viola da gamba. With the rise of what's called historical music performance practice, or the early music movement, these have come back. I started it in college, found the music that I love. Just imitative polyphony. To me, 17th century is the high point of the music. I realize most people don't agree with me, but it's where I found my soul, and I have been playing this instrument ever since. So these are different strands of my life that I'm now going to try and weave together and explain why I think churches are so important in climate. Right? When you look at why people don't care about the climate, it's like, oh, well, they've believed all those lies that it's not true. Yeah, some of that, but why do they believe the lies, right? And for a scientist, I look at what's called the Keeling curve, the graph of CO2 versus time, and I'm terrified. I look at that and realize just how bad it's going to be. I look at the temperature data, and I am scared because I'm a scientist, and therefore I live with data, and I can develop an emotional reaction from data. Right? Most scientists can. We are scared. We think it's really concerning. Nobody's listening. Well, we must just need to give you more data and help you figure out a way to understand it, and you'll all join us. Yeah, right. The psychologists, on the other hand, show that we have 2 parallel systems for processing risk. Risk is fundamentally an emotion that evolved for us to deal with the dangers in, the predator coming at us across the savannah. And we developed our fight or flight response. We have an emotional reaction that moves very quickly, right? Because we hate being afraid. Afraid means you might get eaten. And we do whatever we can to avoid being afraid, right? And if it's a short-term risk, that is really effective. It's a very emotional response. If it's a long-term risk, and there's nothing you can do on the short term, like climate change, the only way to not be afraid is not think about it. And how many of us think about it on a day-to-day basis? We don't. It is unbearable to do, right? If you can, and this is back to, do you want to be safe or feel safe? If you can believe climate change isn't that bad, or whatever it's going to do, it's not worth what we have to give up, right? Because there's another big psychological factor. We hate losing. Advertisers use this all the time. We hate losing much more than we like winning, and so you never present something as what you give up. What do we talk about climate? Oh, you've got to become vegan. Oh, you've got to give up having children. You've got to not be driving your car. Everything that's talked about on an individual level is what you have to give up. We have a really strong emotional reason to not listen to that. Right? since I'm not doing this in quite the order that I thought I would, let me jump to one other bottom line then about this. We cannot solve the climate crisis by giving things up. It's not just that it doesn't work emotionally. It doesn't work physically. There are 8 billion of us on this earth. Those people need to be fed, they need food to be gotten to them, and they need to stay warm in winter, at least in some parts of the world. If we do not change the way in which we produce energy, we can't do it. No matter, we can't feed 8 billion people and not produce carbon unless we change the way in which we do energy. So the only solution is technological. We have to change our energy systems. That's it. There's no other way. Because unless we want to, I suppose if we killed off 7.5 billion of the people, we might be able to manage it. But that's one of the possible alternatives if we don't deal with it now. Right? So all of those things, but I began at this place of data awareness. As most scientists, I said, well, maybe people just don't understand how bad it is. It's pretty, it's a relatively complex science to look at how the temperature's changing. One of the other things, there's no human being in the world, even scientists, who can, in their heads, calculate exponential growth curves. That's just not a natural process. Right? We always underestimate how fast it's going to be going up. One reason Germany was thought to perhaps deal with the pandemic as well as they did is because Angela Merkel was trained as a physicist, and therefore, at least intellectually, knew what an exponential growth curve was. And when she was told this was an exponential growth curve for the transmission of the virus, she got it. Most of the rest of us didn't, and we live with the consequences. Anyway, so how do we get people to understand this growth, what's really happening? And since we don't see, somebody else looks at a graph, they don't get it. I started thinking about the idea of putting it into music. Now, this was something that there was a cellist who actually did this, and I saw it on YouTube. If you just take a conversion curve and say, okay, when the temperature in 1910 is that, and I scale it. Now, 1/2 step for each 0.03 degrees centigrade. Then by the time you're in the 50s, you're in here. Pretty much. And you don't hit the top string until the 1980s. And you don't stay on it until the 1990s. By 1998, you're up here. By 2016, I actually started doing this in 2012. I didn't think I'd be going off the fingerboard, but I did, right? So, but that's just a series of random notes. Like, that's not music. And so I got the idea of using that as what's called a cantus firmus. For those church music people should know this. You go back old enough in church time, we had chants. Everybody knew the chants. So a way to make them more interesting was to stretch out the chant. Tenori means to stretch. It's our word for tenor. You stretched out that line, and then you put a song above it, the cantus altus, the alto. You put a line below it, the cantus bassus, the bass. And that's the beginning of polyphonic music, right? But it's still a really common thing. And so I ended up writing a piece of music that had the cantus firmus be the global temperature data stretched out and put these other songs above it. And you do have it lined up, right?
We've got it.
So take a musical moment. We are at church. Which is by one of the reasons I've stayed Episcopalian. I can't worship without music. So, so here's I explain how I go about to do it. And so it starts in 1880 with one whole note for each year. So I actually get to put the rehearsal marks on the written music in years instead of letters, which is sort of fun. Maybe we can just slip over this a little bit. I've already said it. There we go. Start there. I don't know how much of an emotional reaction you get to that. If it does, it's probably going to convince you to be scared. And scared alone makes us want to not think about it. Right? So how do we change that outcome? And I started a project a couple years ago called Tempo, Music for Climate Action, where we bring together the climate scientists who know what to do, the psychologists who understand why we aren't doing it, with musicians who know how to evoke emotion, to think about which emotion do we need to think about this, because we know that we need the emotional connection, but if it's an emotion just of fear, it is very easy to move to despair, which is actually one of the reasons that I think churches are so important. I remember in my confirmation class decades ago, being told that despair was a sin. And being upset about that. How do you, what control do you have? You get depressed. And despair is not depression. Despair is giving up on God. It's thinking that God doesn't have power. And God's power is us. I'll also, I am a scientist, a neuroscientist. I do believe in evolution. Another reason to be at the Episcopal Church. But it makes me ask the question, why did God choose evolution to create us? And my answer, my hypothesis, I should say, I don't have data, is that free will is so important. He couldn't make us as somebody who loved him or somebody who didn't. We had to be completely free to choose. And evolution gives us complete freedom. Right? It also means that having hope in God means hope in us, that we are God's hands in the world, and we have to do the action, right? Now, you can just get there in the face of bleakness, and, all the logic says that's not true, I have hope anyway. The reality is, scientists are really pretty optimistic about this. We know what needs to be done, right? It's not easy, it's hard, but we know what to do in about most things. Air travel's still a problem. But most of the other things, we really do know. And it means changing our energy production. We need to move to no carbon energy production, which almost certainly means electricity through a variety of forms, which means we need to electrify all of the appliances we use. Right? Now, this can still seem pretty overwhelming. How do I make a difference? Well, how does Pasadena create its energy? And who makes those choices? Who makes the choice to change the investment the city's making towards clean energy? Well, it's our elected officials. It's the people we can go and talk to at City Hall, right? Actually, what can be done at a community level is huge. And at an individual level, this is the one that shocked me the most, but all my climate colleagues tell me it's true. If we were all willing to make a pledge, not to throw away what we have, but the next time you need to buy an appliance, you make a pledge that you will not buy a fossil-fueled appliance. Now, by appliance, your car, too. Your next car. Don't give away your current car, but your next car is going to be electric. Your next water heater is going to be electric. Your next stove. Gas really isn't better than induction, just saying. I've had an induction stove forever, and make that pledge, and if we all did it, this is the astonishing part, if we all did that, we would meet our emissions goals. That is so powerful because electrical appliances are so much more energy efficient. And as we change the way in which electricity is produced, we increase our contribution by doing this. So there are things you can do individually that will really make a difference. Commit to electrification, and now talk about it with other people. Because one of the other things, because climate is so scary, we don't want to talk about it. Okay? It's not probably what conversation you have at your dinner table, unless you've got a really radical kid, right? Because they're going to have to live with these consequences, right? And the other part is, it really is that bad what's coming. We are already seeing the disasters. We're already seeing the wildfires. And that's going to get worse. heat is energy, so a hotter atmosphere has more energy for storms. It's really simple. I was first told this back in 1992. Right? I was like, oh, right, obvious, right? And we've seen it. We've seen all those increases. But also, we are going to reach a point, probably not in my lifetime, but in my children's lifetime, where we will have close to 1 billion people that will need to make the choice between moving and dying. Where they live will become uninhabitable, either underwater or too hot. We don't deal with that very well. The refugees from Syria are sort of the first round. They are in drought because of climate change, right? And we dealt with them poorly. Now start scaling up. And where are we going to be? And, it starts sounding like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But back to God's grace and God's choices, it's our choices to keep it from coming.
So just a couple, I want to get to questions from here. So one of the things I hear when we talk about electrification, and when you say, if every one of us, just the next time we bought an appliance, did one that was 0 carbon, that we'd meet our goals. That's like the most hopeful thing I've heard in so long.
Me too, and I heard this at a conference at Caltech.
Yeah.
And I went to the head of the Institute of Sustainability, who's working with me on my music project. Neil, is this right? Oh, yeah. Are you kidding me? No, not right. And I don't know, guys know who Mary Nichols is? She was the Brown's appointee to head the California Air Resources Board. She created the carbon tax and trade system for California that really put us up ahead. She's also a parishioner at St. James in the City. I asked her about it, and she was like, oh, yeah. I'm like, why aren't we talking about this? Yeah. Because it's something to do. It's hopeful. It's in our grasp. We can each do our piece. Obviously, alone, you can't do it. Mm-hmm. But together we can.
So I want to poke that just a little bit to let you poke back, which is one of the things I hear about electrification, which is a great new word I just learned, is, but electricity is produced by either nuclear power, which is really dangerous, or coal-fired power plants, which produce a lot of carbon for the atmosphere. So you're not really helping much by going electric.
Here's another excuse because I don't want to actually deal with it. That's
right.
Right. That's the motivation. So right. Number one, because electrical appliances are so much more efficient than gas, even dirty electricity gives you a net gain. And as we green up the grid, the contribution increases.
Fantastic. Great. Can you...
And nuclear, the reality is, yes, it feels scary. Those risk perception people got started by studying nuclear. Why are we so terrified of something that's never killed anybody? And there's all sorts of psychological reasons that makes it much more scary. Mm-hmm. Personally, I'd rather stay away from nuclear, but it's a very psychologically fraught
right. And given the choice between the thing we know is going to kill millions and millions of people,
we would kill a lot less people with nuclear than we do with the pollution from the coal-fired plants.
Right. Can you talk just a little about the work for the Bishop's Commission on Climate Change? What are y'all doing, and how can we be involved in that?
Yes, I was supposed to get back there, and then I ramble. So the Bishop's Commission is looking at the various things that need to be done. They approached me about helping develop disaster resilience for our parishes, because we are going to be facing more disasters. We're going to be having wildfires coming through here that are going to be displacing our parishioners, potentially pouring smoke over all of us, potentially moving into the city. At some point, that's going to happen too. And there will be parishes, in Newport, in, Buena Park, that aren't being affected by those fires. How can we help each other? So what I'm doing, and I actually got some funding from the Southern California Edison Foundation to support this, which is sort of amazing, is develop a program for individual parishes on climate and climate disasters. How are we ready to help each other? So that's almost completely put together. I do have an initial cohort this year. It was supposed to have been announced at the diocesan convention, and we ended up with 10 parishes out of this, but I don't think it was very widely announced because a lot of people didn't hear about it. But the first round, we have 10. We're going to be doing a second round next year where we develop these programs for each other, for within our own parishes, and then connect with each other. And how do we connect? Do we do it across economic spectrum? Do we do it nearby? Do we do it far apart so we can help? I decided to take whoever came into the cohort, and then you have a diversity of resources that way. So there'll be a new cohort starting in the fall, when we'll have actually worked out a bunch of this, to do with disaster resilience. How do you help each other? How do you get ready? Do you need to know everybody who's got asthma for when the smoke comes through? Do you have that information already? I don't know, right? That sort of thing. But we're also then combining it with climate education and action, because it turns out to be a really good youth activity. If you want to keep your kids coming to church in spite of confirming them, I'm sorry, isn't that the standard?
That's okay.
Thing? Right, you confirm them and they disappear. They might come back if we really had an active climate program. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at a variety of things like that as well.
Right. Well, and like I remember, this is so good because I remember one of the worst moments of the pandemic for me, other than like moments when like people died, like that I knew, was it was that first summer, I think, and there were all the fires that were going around, and we were like in the middle of this plague, and I walked outside and there was ash falling on my head. And I really thought, okay, this is the end times. We've got a plague going everywhere, and like literally ash is falling from the sky. Yeah,
well, right, war, famine, pestilence, war, and death.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, that's the Revelation bingo card, and we were like, we were grooving on that. And so I want to just sort of, just also for all of you, and thank you so much for turning out. We're going to go to questions in just like a nanosecond, but I want to say, if you weren't at the second half of the annual meeting, and we talked about some of the work that's being done here on campus this summer, Riga's house, the roof, which is about 20 years past its expiration date, is being replaced, but and I got a huge shout out to our Building and Grounds Committee, and particularly to Phil Necker, who has been just phenomenal on trying to get us more energy efficient. And that's part of why we have LED lights in so many places. Phil, you're right over there. Thank you so much for Phil. So two things. First, the air conditioning unit that is going in is going to be maximally energy efficient. The other thing that's going to happen is, instead of it being on the roof, which means we can't put anything else on the roof, it's going to be underneath, which means we will have the capacity to do things like put solar up there. And so we are sort of gearing up to do this, and I would love it if we would be part of this cohort that you all are talking about. So I'm going to move out here. Questions, thoughts? I'm going to move up here and then go down there. We'll start with you, Alice.
Hi. So I'm new to all this energy efficiency stuff, but my neighbor, I live in a condo, she woke me up like big time. So I recycle even my detergent. I get these little sheets and anyway. And I have an electric hybrid car. My question is, all of these electric cars have batteries. What happens to these batteries? Where do they go? How are they recycled?
Actually, right now, speaking of, the scientists know what to do, and it's hard. There's a sort of a big technology push going on right now to develop mechanisms for recycling those batteries. It has to be huge, where, just going and ripping those minerals out of the ground is leading to tropical deforestation that's losing, adding as much carbon as anything else. So it's not yet solved, but there are big projects right now to work on this, to get our battery technology to be sustainable. I don't think there's a solution yet.
Alistair Greaves, thank you for your presentation. I've been reading Kim Robinson's book, The Ministry of the Future, and he makes a couple of good points as far as I'm concerned. One is future generations are not represented. And so the Ministry of the Future was to try to represent them, give them a voice in this discussion. Secondly, he seems to point to a rising tide of protest and even terrorism as the suffering increases, particularly in the 40-40 band of the globe. Any thoughts about that?
Well, that's right. Yeah, the people who are suffering the most from climate change are not the ones who produced it, and that can produce a lot of anger. One of the things is I'm going to do this from the musical point of view because this is where I've been looking at it. It is very easy to be angry. It's very natural to be angry, angry is divisive. Anger is an activating emotion, but it's divisive. And the people that it'd be very easy to be angry at have a lot of power in finding the solution, so it might become really counterproductive. That's where I think that world war is a very significant possibility out of this. And we need to look ahead and recognize that. The other thing about who has the voices for this, the whole concept of community is something Americans don't do very well, right? We are, for the most part, descended from people who chose to walk away from their family and clan to make their own lives better. So we are genetically selected for selfishness, right? And we, right? And our culture maintains this. I know a lot of us turn to the New Zealand church. I was actually just there, had a long talk with, in the cathedral actually, with some of what they're doing on climate change. I recommend looking at it, ecochurch.org.nz, and they are explicitly working with the Maori goals of well-being, which include focused on community, and that's sort of, the Western is more individual and the Eastern is more communal, but the solutions, we've got to find the place in between. We have individual actions, but we have responsibility to the community, and I think that the real solution is going to have to be saying our extreme individualism is hurting everybody, and we've got to find a way to be more communal about it. I think music's a great way to do that. And so I've been working towards finding music that is, not mine. Mine's data awareness. That's not enough. But I've got people like Sean Kirchner, for those of you, right? He's working with us. He's just written 4 different songs, one of Courage to Care and Easy on the Earth. We're trying to find songs that create hope.
Hi, my name is John Armstrong, and thank you for being here. And I love the music pick-up analogy for what's going on in the data. I wanted to bring up that I think visceral reaction is very important in my getting conscious. I remember having always thought the reservoirs and things were very beautiful, and then the impact of drought really got to me when I went and saw how low they were, and it was just frightening. And it also reminded me that I was in Korea in 2016, 17. They just built this beautiful bridge outside of Seoul. And I realized, because I'd just been talking to people about climate change, that in the predictable future, that would be underwater. And I think, what if we built now for what we actually know is going to happen, so the visceral impact is there for us right now?
It would be fantastic. We have to get the commitment to do it. I'm actually working on another project right now in Canada, where they're explicitly asking, we know that building mitigation, climate adaptation, building for what's going to be changing and what we're going to need, especially around disasters, is cost effective. How come we aren't doing it? So we're actually doing this study that's involving a wide range of from engineers to psychologists, trying to work that out with recommendations for the Canadian government, which asked for these recommendations, unlike our government.
Hi, my name is Chad. I have a question about, I found it super interesting when you were commenting about how there is possibility for World War III over conflict in climate change. I was wondering, I know you don't want to get into politics and stuff, but I was wondering if you could just talk about that for a second, because I thought it was really interesting.
Well, I'll say maybe a bit more clearly what I was trying to refer to earlier. Look at what happened with Syria. We had hundreds of thousands of refugees that we didn't want to deal with. They are the first set of climate refugees. Now imagine instead of a few thousand of them, we have a few million or a few hundreds of millions. Because literally people will need to choose between moving and dying. And they will move. I'm not going to sit, well, some people will sit and die in their old homes. Most people will move. And what would we do if we have, 10 million, 50 million refugees showing up? We're dealing with them really poorly now. What's that going to do? And it's another place where if we could think about it ahead of time and plan for it, we would do better. That's one of the things of course, Canada's sort of a winner. They're going to have a bunch more inhabitable land by the time all of this happens. They also have huge flooding problems because of it. But, they're planning for how they're going to start taking in the refugees.
Actually, read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And someone actually asked her and said, how did you come up with this sort of dystopian future? And she said, well, I just took all the existing problems and went 30 years in the future if we continue to do nothing about them. And it's an amazing story of exactly what you're talking about and about the societal disintegration that happens when you put so much pressure on systems and people retreat into self-interest. So thank you. One more over here, and then we're going to have to say goodbye to our online audience, and then we'll stay here for a little bit.
Hi, Lucy. I'm Karen Swanson. I'm also a scientist, so I'm very excited to have you here today. My question is, how can we better respond to the topic that came up within this past year and made headlines in all the papers? That was people getting upset that President Biden was going to take away their gas stoves. That was a window of opportunity for us to educate, and it will come up again. And if we could somehow galvanize a response so that people learn it really is serious and they do need to have it taken away.
Well, all right, if you focus on taking away, you are going to always have conflict. If you can focus on what you're giving them, my usual response is, have you tried an induction stove? It's faster than gas, right? And it doesn't heat you up while you're heating up your food. So there's actually an electrical solution that I literally think is better than a gas stove. And you can focus on the positive, that there's a better place to go. You can get everything from gas and not have to, turn on the air conditioning while you're cooking in the kitchen. So I think that it's the way in which these things are presented. It's messaging, and it's how to stay focused on the hopeful and not on the deprivational. The activists who I understand their anger, but when they scream that everybody's got to stop having children, they're making sure people don't listen to them.
So we're going to, everyone turn and wave at the camera, and let's wave goodbye to our folks who are with us online. Keith has to get over into the church and get ready for the live stream there. So great to see you all. And we'll see you over in the church building in a few minutes. We're going to stick around here for 5 or 6 more minutes. For those of you who are in the room, I'm going to go up to Phil Necker here, and here you go, Phil.